the treaty of peace. In the meantime another man of Bani Kinana, Mikraz bin Hafs, arrived in Makkah. He agreed with what the earlier emissaries had advised the Quraysh, and so they decided to send Suhail bin Amr to negotiate the terms of the treaty. As soon as the Prophet saw him coming, he murmured that they have sent this man. It seems that they want peace. The Prophet also asked to prepare the agreement. Exemplary moderation and prudence. The Prophet summoned Ali and told him to write, "I begin with the name of Allah, Ar-Rahman, the Beneficent, Ar-Rahim, the Merciful." Suhail protested, "I do not recognize Ar-Rahman, but write as is customary upon us." The Prophet then directed Ali, "Write, I begin with your name, O Allah." Some Muslims objected, "No, we must write, I begin with the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful." But the Prophet said again, "Let it be, I begin with your name, O Allah." Then the Prophet asked Ali to write, "This is what Muhammad the Messenger of God has decided." Suhail again objected, "I swear by God, if we had believed that you were God's messenger, we would not have driven you away from the house of God nor fought with you. You shall write, Muhammad be Abdullah. I am God's messenger even if you disbelieve me," replied the Prophet, but still asked Ali to erase out what he had written earlier. "By God, I cannot do it," replied Ali. The Prophet, however, asked Ali to point out the area to be effaced. Ali obliged, and so the Prophet deleted it himself. Treaty or trial. The Prophet resumed in dictating the clause. The agreement is made that the Quraysh shall not obstruct the passage of Muslims to the house of God and shall allow them to circumambulate it. Suhail again raised an objection. "I fear the Arabs would say that we have been too lenient to you in making this agreement. You can visit the Kaaba next year." The Prophet agreed to include the clause in the agreement. Suhail then bravely suggested, "If one of us joins you, he shall be returned to us even if he professes your religion." The Muslims were irked, saying, "What? How can we return a man who seeks our shelter and approval as a Muslim?" The deliberation was still going on when Abu Jandal bin Suhail appeared in chains. He had escaped from Makkah, and had come to the Prophet by a rugged, rocky track between the passes still weighed down in fetters. Suhail lost no time to assert, "Muhammad, this is the first man I demand from you under the treaty." The Prophet replied, "But the treaty is still being written and has not become final." Suhail was irritated. He cried in a huff, "If it is so, then I am not prepared to make any agreement with you." The prophet begged again, "Let him go for my sake." But Suhail refused. He said, "I will not allow him to go even for your sake." Now, the prophet replied, "Then do as you please." Suhail was still growling at the mouth when he retorted, "I can do nothing." Grieved to hear it, Abu Jandal said plaintively, "I have come as a Muslim to you, and I am being returned again to the polytheists. Do you not see what they are doing to me?" Abu Jandal had been put to severe torture for the sake of his faith. The Prophet returned Abu Jandal as demanded by his father. The treaty concluded between the Muslim and the Quraysh assured that both the parties would observe a 10-year truce so that men might live in peace and that no party would lift its hand against the other during the specified period. Another condition of the treaty was that if anyone from the Quraysh came over to the Prophet, without obtaining the permission of his guardian, he would be returned to them, but if any one of those with the Prophet escaped to the Quraysh, they would not be bound to return him. Yet another provision stipulated that any clan that wished to enter a bond and security with the Prophet would be permitted to do so. Likewise, any tribe could resort to a similar agreement with the Quraysh. Faith put to trial. The terms of the agreement and the obligation to return without performing Umrah reduced the Muslims to the most profound depression. It seemed incredible to them how the Messenger of God had agreed to those biased stipulations. So dismayed were they that Umar went as far as speaking his mind out. He went to Abu Bakr and asked him, "Had the Prophet not told us that we would travel to the house of God and go round it?" "Yes," replied Abu Bakr, looking calmly at the sorrowful face of his friend, "but did he tell you that you would go to the house of God and go around it this very year?" Having concluded the treaty, the Prophet sacrificed the animals and had his head shaved. The Muslims sat dejected, for they were feeling beaten and crushed at not being able to visit Mecca and circumambulate the Kaaba at such a time, but when they saw the Prophet performing the rites, they rushed to follow him in sacrificing the animals and shaving their heads. Ignominious peace or signal of victory. The Prophet then broke camp to return to Medina. He was still on his way back to Medina when God confirmed that the truce of Al-Hudaybiyah was not a setback but rather a signal of victory. Lo! We have given thee, O Muhammad, a signal victory, that Allah may forgive thee of your sin that which is past and that which is to come, and may perfect his favor unto thee, and may guide thee on a right path, and that Allah may help thee with strong help. Quran 48:1-3. Umar asked the Prophet, "Is it a victory, O Prophet of God?" The Prophet replied, "Yes, Muslim. Failure or success?" Not long after the Prophet had arrived in Medina, Abu Basr, Utbah b. Usaid broke away from the Quraysh and escaped to him. He was followed by 2 emissaries of the Quraysh to bring him back. They reminded the Prophet of the treaty given by him, and he promptly handed over Abu Basr to them. However, on his way back to Mecca, Abu Basr managed to escape from his guards and fled to the seacoast. Later on, Abu Jandal and some 70 Muslims persecuted by the Meccans also succeeded to escape from Mecca on their own and joined Abu Basr at the seashore, where they established themselves along the road taken by the Quraysh for their trade with Syria. The group of Abu Basr Utbah now sought out the caravans of the Quraysh, robbed their property and threatened the trade route. Once again the trade of Mecca was endangered. The things got so bad that the Quraysh wrote to the Prophet, begging him by the ties of their kinship to him, to summon those highwaymen to Medina and pledge to demand back no more of those who escaped to him in future. The treaty turns to victory. The events that followed proved that the Truce of Hudaybiyah was a decisive step in gaining victory after victory for Islam. The Meccans had gloated over their biased treaty. The Muslims, for their part, had accepted the seemingly inglorious terms of the treaty simply because of their faith in the Prophet. Both parties found Islam making rapid strides soon thereafter in the Arabian Peninsula. It put an end to the Muslims' preoccupation with the threat from Mecca, and before long, it became possible to send deputation out to invite the Caesar and the Negus to accept Islam. The revelation of God had come true. Though it is hateful unto you, but it may happen that hate a thing which is good for you, and it may happen that love a thing which is bad for you. One of the benefits derived from the truce was that the Muslims were no longer perceived as exiles and outlaws, but regarded as a community worthy of Quraysh's attention, with whom they had entered into a treaty as equals. The alliance offered Muslims the rightful place they deserved in the Arabian body politic. And, perhaps, even more important was the atmosphere of peace and tranquility it engendered. The unending war of attrition that had up to now been waged by the Muslims for their very existence, which had been dissipating their vigor and strength, was over. The Muslims could now avail their energies in taking the message of Islam to the unhostile, or rather ambivalent, tribes of the desert. The truce provided the Muslims an opportunity to meet with other tribes and discuss Islam with the tribes thus far hostile to the Islam. They now began to discover how people who ate their food, wore their dress, spoke their language and were born and brought up in Mecca, a city like theirs, had, in a few years, been changed into a new class of people, disdaining corruption, polytheism and idol worship, and rejecting tribal pride, vengeance and bloodlust, a people treading the path of virtue and justice. They could now clearly see that the teachings of Islam and the guidance of the Prophet of God had brought about this change of heart. Thus, within a year of the truce, as many Arabs embraced the faith of the Prophet as had not entered Islam during the last 15 years. There was never a victory in Islam, says Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, greater than this. When the armistice came and war laid down its burdens, people began to meet in safety and converse together. And no intelligent man was apprised of Islam who did not enter it. Within 2 years of the truce as many as those, as had entered it before, embraced Islam, or even more. Ibn Hisham says, Az-Zuhri's assertion is demonstrated by the fact that the Prophet went to Hudaybiyah with 1,400 men according to Jabir b. Abdullah, but 2 years later the Prophet marched with 10,000 men for the conquest of Mecca. Ibn Hisham, Volume 2, page 322. Those Muslims who had been left behind in Mecca for one reason or the other, who were harassed and persecuted by the Quraysh, succeeded, after the conclusion of the treaty, to convert a considerable number of young men to their fold until the Quraysh began to consider them as a new menace. These young men joined the band of Abu Basr, which proved to be a new sword arm of Islam, more dangerous in fact. The Quraysh were forced to request the Prophet to summon these men to Medina. To this, the Prophet agreed, ending the distress of these poor men. All this came to happen as a result of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The attitude of peace and amiability displayed by the Prophet on this occasion, which demonstrated his exemplary patience and moderation, did not fail to impress the tribes which surrendered their faith to Islam. This led them to hold Islam in high esteem and to love and revere it, evoking a wholesome atmosphere for its rapid expansion without any conscious effort on the part of the Prophet or the Muslims themselves.